So I recently heard this story about a rabbi who went to meet with a local Jewish philanthropist. And this philanthropist was known for being quite wealthy and for donating to a lot of very worthy causes. But she had never donated to a Jewish institution. So when the rabbi came to meet with her, she sensed correctly that he was going to ask her for money for his synagogue. And so she said, Rabbi, look, you know I really appreciate what you do. I love what you do. But is the synagogue really more important than feeding the hungry? Is the synagogue more important than donating to causes that protect the rights of the oppressed? Aren't tzedakah and social justice Jewish values? So the rabbi thought for a moment, and then he asked her a question. He said, if those causes are important to you, and I admire that they are, would you rather have a long-term impact on them or a short-term impact on them? And she responded, of course. I try to take a long-term view of all of my philanthropy. So the rabbi said to her, well, if you want more people to be around in 20 years who care about issues of righteousness and of helping the poor and the oppressed, then you should donate to the synagogue. The next day, the rabbi got a call. The philanthropist would be making a significant donation to the synagogue. Why did she write the check? Why was the rabbi right? What makes the Jewish people so concerned about righteousness and justice? I believe that the answer lies in another story. The story the Jewish people tell about themselves. In our Torah portion this week, we read the origin story of the Jewish people. The story we tell ourselves doesn't begin with Jews as successful business people or philanthropists, but as slaves. Our story doesn't begin with opulence, but oppression. Our people began with nothing, not even hope. But luckily, the story doesn't end there. The way that we tell our story, and I'll save most of the juicy details for Passover, but the way that we tell our story, God redeemed us from slavery with a strong hand and an outstretched arm. God brought us from slavery to freedom. In the words of Torah that we're about to read, we get the commandment to tell this story, to tell the story of the Exodus to our children in every generation for all time. The Torah says, quote, "You shall observe this as an institution for all time, for you and for your descendants." And the Torah goes on to say, "And you shall explain to your child on that day, it is because of what God did for me when I went free from Egypt." End quote. And the Jewish people have taken that to heart. Jewish tradition has ritualized the telling of that story in the form of the Passover Seder. Every year, we gather around the table on Passover and we retell the story of our people's exodus from slavery to freedom. And what's crazy is that we don't just mention the Exodus on Passover, the holiday specifically about the Exodus. We'll sing about it in a few minutes out there when we sing the Kiddush. The Kiddush, the Kiddush, Kodesh, which invokes and blesses the holiness of Shabbat. It proclaims that Shabbat is holy because, among other things, the freedom from doing work on Shabbat recalls the freedom achieved in the Exodus. The Kiddush goes, Kihu Yom Techila Lamikrae Kodesh, Zecher Litziat Mitzrayim. Zecher recalls the remembrance of Litziat Mitzrayim, the Exodus from Egypt. But we don't just talk about the Exodus on Passover or on Shabbat. We talk about it every day. In the blessing, in the prayer we just said, the Ve'ahavta, we say, Ani Adonai Elohechem asher hotzeiti etchem Hotzeiti etchem, who brought you out, me'eretz Mitzrayim, who brought you out of Egypt. We really took this to heart. But there are many stories in the Torah. Many, many, many stories in the Torah. So why this one? Why is this story so central to Jewish practice, to who we are as Jews? Why do more Jews attend Passover Seders than any other holiday? And why do we mention the Exodus not just on Passover, not just on Shabbat, but every day? The 20th century theologian Martin Buber says that when we tell the story of the Exodus, quote, every celebrating generation becomes united with the first generation and with all those who followed, end quote. So in other words, telling this story shows us that we are linked in a very long chain. A chain that goes back for generations and which will continue for generations to come. We tell this story because it shows us our place among our ancestors and among our future. But this particular story does more for us than show us our place in history. This story forges our identity. It shapes how we view the world. In the Passover Haggadah, we read that we should tell the story as if we ourselves were slaves. We say, when we were slaves in Egypt. We don't say, when our ancestors were slaves in Egypt. In our generation, in every generation, we must see ourselves as if we were freed from Egypt. That is what it means to have a Jewish identity. That is what it means to have a Jewish identity. To see yourself as having been oppressed, as having been downtrodden, but then redeemed. Having a Jewish identity means acting in the world as if we know what it feels like to go from slavery to freedom. Having a Jewish identity means telling and retelling our story. And commenting on our story, the modern biblical commentator Nehama Leibowitz, she says that, quote, the departure from Egypt is not to be understood as a single historic act that once took place. It's not just a historic act, but as a task confronting every generation and every individual. The Exodus is a task confronting every generation and every individual. So what is our task? Why do those of us in this room keep telling our story? When our children grow up in a world where people's differences are more important than what they have in common, we must tell the Jewish story. When our children grow up in a world where fear is stronger than love, we must tell our story. And when we want our children to care about and to fight for righteousness and justice, we must tell our story. Shabbat Shalom.